First of all, welcome everyone. I don't know if there's some new faces here, but let me just say that this is the Classical Forum for Contemporary Issues. We try to bring to academic audiences voices that are rarely heard on campus today, including pro-Israel and pro-Western voices, as well as dissident voices from non-Western authoritarian societies. Today, I'm really thrilled to introduce Dr. Sheree Trotter. She is a Maori person. She earned her PhD in history from the University of Auckland, writing on Zionism in New Zealand, which I wasn't even aware that it would have existed, but apparently it did. In 2012, she co-founded the Holocaust and Antisemitism Foundation. And recently she, I think, co-organized the Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem seminar at the Bible Lands Museum in Jerusalem. So today she'll be speaking on what's wrong with settler colonialism, indigenous rights in New Zealand and in Israel today. Please, Sheree.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction and welcome and greetings to you all. Yes, I am Indigenous to New Zealand, Indigenous Maori New Zealander, and but I've been involved with the Jewish people in Israel for many years now, as the introduction indicates. And we opened the Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem a year ago in Jerusalem. So it's still very much at a startup phase, but we've set that up to give a platform for Indigenous supporters of Israel to have that place there. And we have a number of goals with that. So just to let you know a little bit about where I'm coming from before we get into settler colonialism. And I do have a PowerPoint to show you, but I guess part of the context for this discussion is that New Zealand is very much in this moment right now of dealing with settler colonialism, dealing with decolonization. And it's a very fraught conversation at the moment between the different sides, two main sides, but many sides, of course. And so I will be bringing some of that out in the conversation. I will talk a little bit about what's happening in New Zealand. I'll talk a little bit about how it applies to Israel. But I thought, firstly, we probably need to just review what we're talking about when we talk about settler colonialism. And so I shall share. And this is a word that we hear a lot about today. And it comes out of the field of colonial studies, which really began in the 1950s and 60s and then fragmented into different discourses, methodological approaches, and associated terminologies, such as neo-colonialism, internal colonialism. Of course, post-colonialism emerged as a scholarly approach in the 1980s. And this emphasized the enduring legacy of colonial regimes and the ways in which these legacies continue to inform relationships and representational strategies after the end of formal colonial subjection. There was also the new imperial history that followed in the 1990s. So settler colonialism as a concept emerged from post-colonial studies, and in the 1990s it develops as its own field of inquiry. And it was led by Australian scholars Patrick Wolfe, Lorenzo Veracini. They've been credited with founding and developing this field of study. So for proponents of settler colonialism, they see it as a specific form of colonialism where settlers move from a metropole or an imperial power base to a new region. They establish permanent residence there. They seek to replace the existing Indigenous population and their ways of life with their own. So unlike other forms of colonialism that may focus on extractive colonialism or administrative colonialism, which is focused on governance without a significant settler presence. Settler colonialism is characterized by the goal of creating a new society that is built around the settlers' culture, governance, and economic system. These are some of the key features of settler colonialism. Land seizure. Settler colonialism prioritizes the acquisition of land for settlement and agriculture, often displacing or dispossessing Indigenous peoples. Displacement and elimination. Indigenous populations are often forcibly removed, marginalized, or subjected to policies aimed at erasure, such as assimilation, cultural destruction, or even genocide. Permanent settlement. The settlers do not intend to return to their original homeland. They establish themselves as the dominant population in the colonized region. For policies towards Maori, the idea of assimilation or integration towards assimilation. And then, of course, today Israel is held up as a settler colonial nation, and we'll go into that a bit more further down. So just touching on some of the thinkers behind settler colonialism, we have Frantz Fanon, who, although he predated the formal development of settler colonial studies as a distinct field, his work is now widely seen as foundational. He built Patrick Wolfe, who was one of the founders of settler colonialism. He built on Fanon's framing of settler colonialism as a structure that seeks Indigenous elimination. And he saw a binary division between the settler world and the native world. He considered settler colonialism to be inherently violent and believed that decolonization required violent rupture. He discussed the psychological impact on colonized subjects who internalize inferiority, leading to complex psychic oppression. So there were many Maori academics who were influenced by some of Fanon's thinking. One such academic is Graham Heningaro Smith, and Graham Smith made a comment like every page of Fanon's work, through The Wretched of the Earth, he could identify with. And so they see, I'm speaking now of Fanon and Graham Smith, they see decolonization as a transformation movement, not just reform. Fanon's core idea was that colonial systems cannot simply be reformed, they must be fundamentally dismantled and replaced. And for this Maori academic, Graham Smith, he developed what we call kaupapa Maori theory, which is a theory of a Maori worldview theory, and emphasized that Maori education cannot be truly transformative if it's simply integrated into Western systems. It must be Maori-led, Maori-defined, and it must fundamentally restructure the educational landscape to serve Maori aspirations and not just colonial institutions. So both of these thinkers reject superficial inclusion of Indigenous peoples and call instead for deep systemic transformation. And so that was Frantz Fanon. Now, Michel Foucault also predated the development of settler colonialism, but had a great influence on the thinking, particularly around the area of understanding power and knowledge and governance. So he did a lot of work, of course, in this whole concept of power and knowledge, arguing that they're intertwined and that those who control knowledge also control power. And he was very influential has been influential across academia. However, from an Indigenous perspective, his frameworks are seen as insufficient in actually dealing with Indigenous issues around land and sovereignty and the logic of elimination. But his ideas certainly influenced settler colonialism. I'll come back to Edward Said, But Patrick Wolf and Lorenzo Veracini were key thinkers who developed this field. Patrick Wolf defined settler colonialism as a process of invasion, of mass settlement and elimination of the native. And he believed that settler colonialism and genocide go hand in hand. But his version of genocide is different from the traditional version or the UN Genocide Convention. He sees genocide as not limited to isolated acts of mass violence, but an ongoing process embedded in the logic of settler colonialism. And so things like forced assimilation, destruction of cultural practices, erasure of language and identity, removal of children from communities, which of course happened in places like Canada and Australia, in some ways in New Zealand, not to the same degree. So he sees all these things as being part of elimination, and he defines those as genocide. And so Lorenzo Veracini is an Australian, he's an Australian academic, and he's known for his work on structure, logic, and global patterns of settler colonialism. His research focuses on how settler colonialism differs from other forms of colonialism and how it functions as an ongoing system of domination, not simply a historical event. And so they are some of the key thinkers, the last two in particular. But Edward Said, of course, as you all know, was very influential in as a founder of post-colonial theory. And he discussed the notions of discourse and power, analysing how language and knowledge production are linked to power. And his work revealed how Western scholarship perpetuated power imbalances by constructing the Orient as exotic, backward, and inferior. Now, the interesting thing about Said, of course, when we're thinking about settler colonialism, is that he was himself, or called himself Palestinian, although he was born in Egypt. He was born in Jerusalem, rather, but moved to Cairo and lived there until he went to the US and worked at Columbia University. And he was a prominent literary theorist. But his works, these works, Orientalism and the Politics of Dispossession, were highly influential. Orientalism, of course, in developing this idea of the other and in the way in which Orientals were discussed and talked about in Western literature and the Western discourse, and treated as less than, of course, treated with racism. This is, what he kind of put forward. But the politics of dispossession, of course, was about the Palestinians and its powerful rhetoric. But from a historical perspective, there are so many gaps, in his narrative. And I think this is one of the key things to understand about Said. He was definitely influential in the development of post-colonialism, but he wasn't a historian. And yet he had that power to influence people's thinking on the Palestinian situation. And of course, Said developed a relationship with the PLO. Early on, he acted as an informal advisor and helped to build the legitimacy of the PLO in the West. But when it came to the Oslo Accords, he opposed the agreement. He saw it as a betrayal of Palestinian rights. And he condemned the PLO also. He condemned PLO after that for corruption and authoritarianism, but also for compromising too much with Israel. So he was a significant figure. Now, today, Israel is held up as a settler colonial nation, kind of as the poster child for settler colonialism. But there are many problems with that. firstly, of course, the whole historical connection. Jews have a historical spiritual connection to the land of Israel dating back thousands of years, unlike typical settler colonial projects, which involve foreign populations claiming unrelated territories. The establishment of Israel is a return to an ancestral homeland. And of course, exile and persecution. The Jewish migration to the region was driven by centuries of persecution, including pogroms in Europe and the Holocaust. And this distinguishes it from other settler colonial projects, which were largely motivated by economic expansion or imperial directives. Of course, there's no metropole for the re-establishment of Israel, which settler colonialism is typically supported like a colonizing mother country. So, of course, Britain is the metropole for the establishment of the settlement of New Zealand. Israel doesn't have a colonial parent state directing its settlement efforts. Zionism was a nationalist movement, not a colonial enterprise initiated by an imperial power. And then, of course, Israel was formed with the consent of the international community and has legal foundations in its establishment, such as the League of Nations mandate in 1920 and the United Nations Petition Plan of 1947. So this also distinguishes Israel from settler colonial systems imposed without global consent. So I want to point out some of the problems with settler colonial theory, and I think it's important to understand that it is a theory. It's a political ideology, I would say, that imposes a particular lens, a frame of interpretation on history and culture and politics. So, as I've said there, it's a totalizing dogma. It's not just an analysis, and it's a whole worldview by which everything is interpreted through this lens of power relationships. And so you have the oppressed and the oppressor, you have the settler and the indigenous, and it's and of course that's problematic. That's problematic because the indigenous, for indigenous, it robs us of our agency and of our choices and of the fact that we don't see ourselves historically. I'm speaking not just me personally, but Maori have not always seen themselves as oppressed. There are some who see themselves as oppressed and have seen themselves as oppressed, but there's been a lot of agency shown by Maori historically. Maori have always stood up for their rights, and they've used whatever channels have been available to them. And then there's also the fact that when settlers came to New Zealand, Maori embraced new things and embraced new technologies, embraced literacy. Many embraced Christianity. So Maori had choice. They weren't just oppressed. They weren't just the victims. But this is one of the problems that I see with settler colonial ideology, is that it's very much locked into a whole totalizing dogma that you've only got these two groups, the binary of the oppressor and the oppressed. And so when I say totalizing, use the word dogma because it's become like a religion where there are doctrines of sin, guilt, punishment, rewards, apostasy, but I would say no redemption. And so what do I mean by that? So they've set up this ideology and this way of thinking that you've really got to toe the party line. And I'm thinking in the Maori, in the New Zealand context here, by some of these ideologues who hold to these views, is that, for example, there's one of these academics has set up a treaty checklist. Now, in New Zealand, we have one founding treaty. It's called the Treaty of Waitangi, very controversial in New Zealand at the moment as to what the meaning of the treaty is and what the principles of the treaty are. But this particular academic, Tina Ngata, she has set up a tangata treaty, or a treaty checklist. And this is for settlers it's a checklist for settlers to show how well they're doing and whether they are meeting the grade and how well they're keeping to the terms of the treaty. And so in this way, it becomes like a religion. It's like a litmus test for Maori identity. So if you don't tick these boxes, if you don't do the things that they think are required to be truly decolonized, then you're considered to be colonial Maori. And so individuals must form these sort of ongoing rituals of guilt and self-flagellation to maintain legitimacy, like constant public acknowledgement. And on the other hand, settlers are seen as always complicit no matter what they do. And when you're looking at history, of course, this whole model doesn't work because the settlers weren't always oppressors. You know, many of the settlers who came to New Zealand were not wealthy people. They came on a promise that they were going to have an opportunity to buy some land and to establish a new life for themselves. But they came here and found a rugged country, an undeveloped country. Many of them would have turned back if they could, but it was too far away. And so this notion that they came as all powerful settlers is incorrect. And so there's this sense of orthodoxy and heresy. There's your thinking and your discourse are being policed by these notions. And people who question any part of the theory will be labelled colonial apologists. And it creates a form of intellectual gatekeeping, which is similar to religious orthodoxy, where deviation is treated as a moral failing or a betrayal. And so this notion of settler colonialism being a structure and not event is a key idea, that we're not just talking about colonialism in the past, something that happened where settlers came in and colonized. We're talking about the whole system that's been set up, this Western system. Of course, settler colonialists, they rail against the Western institutions, against the Enlightenment, against all of the structures that have been set up in our Western democratic nations, including the government, including academia, including health systems, economics. These are all seen as colonial products. And there's this tendency to overgeneralize and homogenize. It collapses history. It has no respect for history. It's presentist, and it uses history for political purposes. It twists historical events. It cherry picks the parts that fit the agenda or provides a skewed agenda. It tends to come, and I think that it's significant that settler colonialism tends to come from the fields of anthropology and sociology rather than history, area studies, or international relations, which would give a wider range of examples of past and present conflict. And to give you one example of the way history is distorted and misused is that in New Zealand, some of these Indigenous scholars have decided that the doctrine of discovery was a key part of the establishment of British rule in New Zealand. Of course, the doctrine of discovery was a series of papal bulls from 1400s that the Catholic Church, where they decreed that Christian explorers could claim lands and subjugate the non-Christian peoples in that land. And this was used, of course, in countries like the United States and Canada, but it was never applied in New Zealand. For a start, New Zealand colonization came under the British, who were Protestant and had nothing to do with the Catholicism. And so it's just another example of how history is misused. And also tensions with Indigenous studies. Indigenous scholars have problems with settler colonialism as well because it centres the settlers. And Indigenous studies, of course, they want to centre rather the Indigenous peoples and study from that perspective. And so I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what's happening here in New Zealand. We do have a Maori party in New Zealand, which has developed over the years. It started in 2004, and it started as a protest to what the government was doing with settlements. So we have had, since the 1970s, we've had a process by which Indigenous people can go to the government with their claims for the lands that were stolen from them. And in 2004, there was a claim about the foreshore and seabed. And of course, the ocean is one of the things that Maori feel an ownership for, which was promised in the treaty to them. And the government was threatening to take any Maori claim on it away from them. And so there was a huge protest about that. And out of that, the Maori Party was formed. And so its creation was a decolonial move, and it aimed to centre Maori voices and sovereignty in Parliament. And so its founding aligns with decolonisation as Indigenous self-determination within the structures of the New Zealand state. But what we've seen today, and I'll jump forward to where we are today, is that our current Māori Party is actually an activist party. They're not trying to work within the state. They are wanting to bring Māori self-determination forward, and they're constantly challenging the state. And of course, they call the system colonial. So it's a little bit ironic that they are down there in Parliament. They've been voted into Parliament, and they're using their place within the system to rail against the system. And so I don't know if any of you would have seen a video that went viral of this young woman on the right here, the Māori Party did a haka in Parliament during a vote, which was not it was not part of the rules that they could do that at that particular time. But this was to do with the Treaty Principles Bill. So we have a right-wing party that has pushed this Treaty Principles Bill, where they're wanting to rethink and have a conversation about what the treaty principles actually are. We've had this notion of treaty principles since the 1980s, I think, and it's been developed through a judicial process. But for many in New Zealand, Maori priorities have been, in their view, becoming too strong and taking over. So anyway, this right-wing party, the ACT Party, put forward this Treaty Principles Bill, which many Maori saw as threatening their place in society, threatening our foundational treaty. And so this young woman, who is a member of Parliament, at the vote, she ripped up the bill, and the Māori Party leaders did a haka in the House. Now, a haka can be used in many different situations and is used in New Zealand in many different situations. You might have seen it used on the rugby field. And a haka can be used to honour people, or it can be used to show your objection to something. There's lots of different ways that the haka can be used. And it is part of Māori culture, and it's accepted in many parts of New Zealand culture as well now. But in this instance, because it took place within the House at a time of voting, it was seen it was transgressing the rules of the House. And so the Parliamentary Privileges Committee have censured these politicians and actually given them punished them in quite an extreme way, far beyond any previous misdemeanor. And so they've been given the two leaders have been given a 21-day suspension, and the young woman a 1-day suspension. And so for those looking on, it really looks like the power of the state coming down on the Indigenous people. who were objecting to their treaty being undermined. And on the slide, you can get an idea of where the Māori Party is standing. The Te Pāti Māori is the Māori Party is an assertion of our mana motuhake, which is our self-determination and our liberation. As a Māori, hang on, I can't see it. As a Māori political movement, we are guided by our tikanga, which is our worldview, our values, and will always fiercely advocate for the interests of our whānau, hapu, and iwi, which is our family and tribes and sub-tribes in Parliament and government. We envisage a new New Zealand, Aotearoa Hou is a new New Zealand, where tangata whenua, the people of the land, tangata moana is the people of the sea, meaning the Pacific peoples who have come, and tangata treaty, which is the settlers, the people who have come as a result of the treaty. Together we'll realise the true intent of the Tiriti o Waitangi, which is our founding document, the Treaty of Waitangi. So we have this activist party that is seeking to decolonise, and they have taken on board the Palestinian cause as their own cause. And this is an example of the sort of rhetoric that they have been pushing. That Palestine is the last bastion of resistance against global Western colonisation. If Palestine is not free, neither are we. And so the problem with this narrative is that the Māori Party they are seeing the whole conflict from the perspective of settler colonialism. They are seeing it as the Jews being the foreign colonisers who came in and dispossessed the indigenous Palestinians. So they're not looking at the Middle Eastern context. They haven't acknowledged the long history of the Jewish people to that land, that it is actually their indigenous land. They haven't acknowledged the Islamic fundamentalism and the radical Islamist terrorist groups that Israel is fighting against. They've ignored all of that context, and they're just seeing it as an example of settler colonialism. And so the Māori Party have really been at the forefront of leading this Palestinian movement along with the Green Party in New Zealand. And while the Māori Party only has a small part of the vote, they have been very effective with social media in influencing young Māori. So they have a lot of young Māori followers, and through a lot of their performative kind of practices, they certainly get attention in the nation, in the media. I'm just looking at the time, and I was just briefly going to finish off with the fact that the Jews are the indigenous people, and I find this a helpful definition of indigeneity, the ethnogenesis of a particular group in a particular land within which a unique culture and language develops. And of course, for the Jewish people, that is in Israel and Judea, Samaria, where they develop their culture. This quote is also helpful from Ben Freeman, who's just published a book, The Jews and Indigenous People. He says an Indigenous people are a group whose collective identity began in one specific land. It is in that land they remain rooted either physically, spiritually, or culturally. And Ben Freeman, who's Scottish, talks about how I think it was during, I think it's Rosh Hashanah, where every year they had to try and find a pomegranate in Scotland for their festival. And he just sort of highlights that as an example of being rooted in that land, and even the fruit that you use in your celebrations is oriented towards the land of Israel. The UN, of course, has these different definitions for what an Indigenous person is, or a people: self-identity, historical continuity, link to land, distinct social, economic, political systems, distinct language, culture, and beliefs. And I believe that the Jewish people meet all of these requirements, or all of this criteria, through their continuously occupied ancestral lands. In Māori culture, we have a concept called ahika, which means keeping the fires burning. And so the fact that there's always been a Jewish presence, even though at times very small, is part of it's an indigenous thing. Of course, common ancestry with the original occupants, self-identity. The Jewish people have always seen themselves as a people, Israel, and the distinct common culture and language and religion that emphasizes spiritual ties to the land. And so I will leave it there for now, and welcome your questions.
And it was very educational for me, especially about the Maori situation in New Zealand, which doesn't appear as much as it perhaps could in the media and so forth. So it was very, very interesting. I thought your points were very sharp. So I guess the broad question I want to ask is, so it seems that anti-colonial ideology at the moment is the strongest anti-Israel ideology at work today. I mean, it's what you always see on the campuses throughout the Western world, this kind of ideology. And it seems to me that there's two potential ways to confront it that you both of which you kind of touched on. So one is to basically accept the ideology, right? The idea of dividing the world more or less into Western oppressors and oppressed colonial peoples. But exculpate Israel as a special case in some way, but try to exculpate Israel by pointing to the fact that there was no metropole, that they have indigenous ties to the land and so forth. But it seems to me I mean, you can argue that the bigger picture is challenging the ideology itself, raising critical questions about it. Not obviously that it's entirely wrong. In some ways, it was a corrective to the glorifying views of the West that were prevalent in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, right? But it seems to have reached the point of such an extreme one-sidedness that people ignore the fact that many of the phenomena it critiques are not unique to the West. I mean, look at imperialism, right? The Islamic presence in the Levant is a result of 7th and 8th century Islamic imperialism, to give one obvious example. The fact that the Arabic language is extended, they basically conquered the world from Spain to the borders of India. They were empires in China. They were empires in India. They were empires in Africa. When the Spanish arrived in the New World, you had the Aztec empires, and you had people rallying to the Spanish, indigenous peoples rallying to the Spanish against Aztec oppression. So, I mean, it seems like a very complex 5 centuries of history is being reduced to a narrative of oppressors and oppressed. And I'm just not 100% sure that Israel's going to win by just claiming that we have nothing to do with the West, that Israel has nothing to do with that they're going to win over, even just tactically, whether that's going to work. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that and sort of how to confront the challenge.
Yes, well, thank you for that. Yeah, my view is that settler colonial ideology is flawed, and that we need more and more people looking into that, researching it, and talking about those flaws. Certainly in the context that I'm in here, I'm being accused of being a colonial Maori because I side with Israel. And one of these academics wrote a whole article on the work that I'm doing. And what she effectively does is that she, for Maori who don't line up with her set of requirements for being truly Indigenous or truly Maori, she rejects their credibility or their identity, or she labels them colonial Maori. The problem with that is that historically it's flawed, it's untrue, because there've always been Maori who have sided with the Crown. In the 19th century, we had Maori who fought with the Crown, and they fought with the Crown for their own purposes, for what they wanted for their tribe. They decided it was best for them to fight with the Crown. So they were labelled kupapa, meaning traitor. So, we've had that thinking for a while, but today, and you're right, settler colonialism developed quite recently in the 1990s. It developed from Australia. So it's really, I think, focused on the settler colonial nations where there are still Indigenous peoples who are struggling for their own self-determination, like the Indigenous Australians and Canada, America, New Zealand. In terms of Israel, my view, and this is why I'm doing the work I'm doing with the Indigenous Embassy and Indigenous Coalition for Israel, is to emphasize the fact that Jews truly are Indigenous people. They are the original, you could say, Indigenous people. They've had the experiences that Indigenous people have today of being dispossessed of their land, of being colonized, of being kicked out of their land, and yet they've returned and revitalized their language or re-established, their Indigenous language. So for us, that is inspirational because our languages are under threat, and we in New Zealand are trying to revive our language. We've got a long way to go. So I hold up Israel, the Jewish people, as a model of indigeneity. And I think that's an effective way to argue Israel's case.
Raphael has his hand up. I invite you to speak, Raphael.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation and, for supporting Israel. I have a question and, apologize if I'm very tactless, but, what's the point of having a discipline called colonial studies? Why can't we just subsume it in the general field of history? After all, it's clearly ideological, it's clearly partisan, it clearly serves an agenda that has been harmful to all to Africans and Asia since it, perpetuates a victimhood narrative. What's your take on this?
Well, I think these fields have developed because there's been it seemed to be a gap, I guess. What they're trying to do is centre the Indigenous peoples and centre their concerns.
Oh,
and you see this throughout historiography, is that, at one stage we were writing, or historians were focused on national histories where the nation was at the centre, and then others came along and said, no, we need to unsettle that. We need to write Marxist history, or we need working class history, we need women's history. So there are a lot of different fields of history that are wanting to focus and centre different parts of society. And I think, colonial studies and decolonization is part of that, trying to centre the plight of the Indigenous. And I think Indigenous studies, it's another field, of course, is actually a more hopeful, productive way of moving forward, and that Indigenous studies is about centering the Indigenous, but we're not necessarily having to see ourselves as victims all the time, because we like to talk about agency and how the things that we have done that are positive.
So there is a suggestion. Can we encourage Professor Trotter to put forward the work that you're doing in popular forums, such as New York Times and other media? That's the first question. The second one is, why do you think that Israel is held up as a colonialist rather than as return or success of the Indigenous? Why do Indigenous people not celebrate Israel's success? Is there perhaps something about the power or success of Israel that upsets the narrative of the Indigenous as eternally victim and powerless?
To the first point, I'd love to write for what was it, Times of New York Times. If anybody has an open door there, do let me know. I'm finding even in New Zealand, they've stopped publishing articles from people like me who are pro-Israel, so it's quite difficult to get our articles out there now. Now, the second question about why Israel is seen as colonialist. So it's been a long campaign, decades-long campaign, with people like Edward Said working with the PLO, with the Soviet Arab Alliance, working hard to create this narrative of Israel being colonizers. If you think back to, of course, the UN is complicit in this, the UN saying that Zionism is racism. So it's been a long campaign in these different areas. The Arab-Soviet Alliance, or the Green-Red Alliance, is one, and then within academia. So they've all kind of converged to create this impression of Israel being a colonialist state. And what was the third question? Sorry.
That was it. There are more questions, but now Gabriel has a question, and there are other people who have their hands raised. So, and then Hanok after Gabriel.
Hi. Yes, thank you, Sheree, for this fascinating talk and for raising all these problems, these issues. I fully agree with you that the Jews are in a way, the paradigm of an indigenous people. And I would base that on the literature of the Jewish people. I made a talk about this previously in this forum, but the Hebrew language is the indigenous language of this entire area, spoken not just by the Jews, but also by all the tribes who lived here, including the Moabites and the Edomites. So this Hebrew literature is, the indigenous literature of this area. And not only that, but the entire history of Hebrew literature after the original, biblical literature, the Mishnah, the Midrash, every single thing that was written by the Jews was related to the original biblical indigenous story. And that's just an incredible and I think unparalleled story of indigenous continuity. Even when they were, and as far as you mentioned the point about there were always somebody there. What if they were kicked out? Would that really end their connection? I mean, that would be saying that might makes right. That if people are able to kick you out of your land, then they've destroyed your right to come back. And that just seems so unjust. And I'm sorry to take up a little bit more time, but also this idea about even if you take it that there's no indigeneity to the Jews, let's say, still, when we talk about which is worse, there's many different categories here. You've got I understand settler colonialism to mean you keep your original country, but you also take over another group's country. And I agree, that's greedy. That's greedy. People don't need two countries. One country is more than most groups have. One country should be okay to have. So I don't see how Israel fits, even if they're not indigenous. I don't see how they fit any way into this settler colonialism idea from a moral point of view. And I would still make I think there's many distinctions that need to be made here. For example, I would call it probably migrant settlerism, let's say. I mean, if a whole entire nation moves from one place to another, that's not usually called settler colonialism. That's a very common phenomenon in history. All nations have moved from one place to another. And why, is that better? Is that worse? I would like to see debate about these distinctions between different kinds of historical movements and not just lump everything together, because we're very good at distinguishing between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which are the same thing. And why can't we distinguish between things that are very, very different?
Yes, thank you. I agree with you. Good points.
Okay, thank you.
Hanoch, you have your hand up.
Thanks for your talk. I've learned a lot from it. And I'm sorry to hear about the difficulties you face now in New Zealand with publication and so on. I'd like to ask two questions about the settler colonialism discipline, because I'm sure you know much more about it than I do. And first, I'm not sure that colonialism as used now is often the right term, because if I look at the British rule in India, in Southeast Asia, in much but not all Africa, there weren't colonies there. You look at the places now, they didn't build any city or whatever, and until not too long ago, people talked about imperialism, which I think is correct about the British or French or German rule in many of those places, not all places, New Zealand and Australia and the American continent from north to south, colonized by the English and the Spanish and Portuguese. But imperialism is somehow lost. I don't know whether there's a discussion of this in the literature. And the second question, or if you related, if you look at Asia, then most Western countries that practiced imperialism there, like England and France, don't have any colonies there. The only Western power that has colonies and destroyed civilizations by migrating people and so on is Russia, that from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific settled the Russians in places like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and so on and so forth. Yet Russia is used as a kind of ideological anchor in much of the literature today. So I'd like to know whether there's any discussion of Russia as the strongest Western colonial power in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, interesting question. Well, there is a whole field of studies on imperial studies, of course, and there are different kinds of colonialisms, like extractive colonialism and administrative, where they went in to extract goods or to set up an administration. But settler colonialism is specifically about those situations where settlers go in to settle in the land and to replicate a society very similar to the one that they left behind. And New Zealand's an interesting case study because for many, many years, there was a very strong tie to Britain, and we were seen as the Britain of the South. And New Zealanders prided themselves on being very British. You know, there wasn't so much a what's the word, whites only policy here in New Zealand, but there was a British first policy. With immigration, you know, Britons were the desirable immigrants to bring here. So there was that going on. But with regard to Russia, that's interesting. I don't know a lot about Russian imperialism, but yeah, something for me to look into. So thanks for raising that.
Thanks very much.
We did have it our last year. We had our inaugural symposium in Jerusalem. And if anyone's going to be in Jerusalem in November, we're having another one because we see this as a way of fighting back. You know, we want to start to tell the other side of the story and bring some different narratives to the fore. But we had a woman from Kazakhstan there who shared her research about she mentioned the Russian and sort of colonization, but she also talked about the strong Jewish Kazakhstani links in their culture and heritage, which was fascinating. And that's on our website, indigenousembassy.org. Her presentation is on the website there if anyone's interested to look at that.
Thanks very much. I'll check it. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Duran, Timothy, you're invited to ask a question.
Oh, thank you so much. This was an excellent talk. I had never thought about connecting the experience of, Jews in Israel with a Maori. That was completely new to me. So thank you so much. A couple of points I would make. There's an author named Bruce Gilley, or Gilley, Gilley. He wrote an article called "The Case for Colonialism." It got completely pilloried. He got into a huge amount of trouble, and it's very, very interesting. He also wrote an article called Chinua Achebe. It's about Chinua Achebe, saying, Chinua Achebe himself had some positive points to make about colonialism. So this is really interesting stuff. I teach a historiography class every semester, and I do the obligatory Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, but I also try to point, we can't be completely negative about every aspect of colonialism in the cases where, for example, the British stopped, forced clitoral removal or something. It's very difficult to say that the British were wrong to do this. So I try to get my students to think in these terms. The second thing I was going to say is when we're talking about the indigeneity of the Israelites or the Hebrews, we do have to realize this is a hill country, ethnogenesis. Moving west into the coast, they run into the Palisades. We're talking about the late Bronze Age here, very, 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 very early Iron Age, around 1200. So technically, it could be argued that the Palisades were occupying the coastal regions before the Israelites moved west from the hill country, if we want to go as far back as the late Bronze Age. The Peliset were named by the Egyptians as one of the sea peoples that ended the late Bronze Age. So someone could make an argument for that, but we don't have anything like the astonishing corpus of literature that the Israelites produced. We don't have that for the Peliset at all. Someone could make a slender claim to that, and the Peliset are the ones that eventually their name is eventually used for Roman Palestina and for the Philistines. So that's an interesting connection that has to be looked at, I think. My last point is this. I do feel as though a lot of these maneuvers around colonialism are simply different ethnic groups trying to press some kind of advantage and trying to claim oppression. And I don't know if facts, including the facts that I'm offering up here, are going to change anyone's opinion. And I kind of think that this is the bottom line to all of this. Sometimes bringing evidence is not going to work. And this is kind of an issue of different groups using whatever means they can to press for the advantage of their group. And I think this is the big problem with all this. But thank you so much for this talk. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. There's definitely a political agenda for some of these academics who are pushing their views. To your point, yes, the settlement of New Zealand, the British government were actually quite reluctant to set up a government here, and the governor was told that he could only do it with the consent of the natives. And so the British, by this stage, 1840, were quite enlightened, really, in the way that they settled New Zealand. And the initial request came partly from Maori, along with missionaries, for some governance. They wanted some governance to control the unruly settlers who were causing trouble in this country. So they wanted the governor to come and set something up to control their own people, essentially. But of course, the Maori were the dominant population here, so they never envisaged what they were opening the door to. So that was one point. And I wanted to speak to your other point about, oh yes, the Plechet. I think the key thing to understand about indigeneity, that it doesn't mean that you're the first person in the land necessarily. It really is talking about connection to the land. So the land within which your unique culture, religion, practices, literature develops makes you indigenous to that particular land. So if we think about Maori, for example, Maori tribes came here from the Pacific, from other nations. They brought many of the ideas and cultural practices from those Pacific nations. But in New Zealand, they developed a unique culture that was developed in this land, in relationship with this land. They went through the land naming all the mountains and the rivers, and Maori thinking, you know, they were their ancestors and their gods. And so they developed the unique Maori culture within this land. And I see it the same with the Jewish people, that their unique culture was developed within a specific land. And so the issues of, you know, there were people there before, or there were people over here, it's not really relevant to the concept of indigeneity. Finally, what was the surname of what was Bruce's surname that you mentioned? I will look that up.
Gilly or Gilly? It's Gilley.
Thank you.
Okay, and there are more questions in the Google sheet. So
I would just like to respond a little bit more to Timothy's thoughts, which he articulated very beautifully, about the history of this land. Probably the people who lived in Plechet, which is the region on the coast, are probably were Mycenaean Greeks. This is what most scholars believe, and they didn't remain Mycenaean Greeks for very long. I mean, they did for a while, but they originally, at some point, they basically assimilated into the Jewish population. Samson actually probably, you know, there was the long-haired Achaeans. There's the long-haired Achaeans are mentioned in the Iliad. And I have questions as to whether Samson was really a Nazir or somehow a copier of Mycenaean practices. But in any case, they had disappeared by the time the Romans got here. The Romans called this place Judea. I'm saying, making these points because some people, some Palestinians seem to claim that they are descended not from the Jews. And how can that be? Because by the time of the Roman period, look, Herod was originally an Idumean, but he built the temple and he became essentially a Jew. And the whole region basically adopted the same idea. You don't see in the New Testament any mention of Palestinians. There's just not in existence at the time. There's one Canaanite woman from Lebanon that's mentioned, but she's probably not even a Canaanite. She's a Phoenician. And in any case, I find that idea that there's still Palestinians here is completely historically inaccurate. These are invaders from the south.
Sheree, do you want to respond to that, or do you want to go to the Google Doc for questions?
I agree. So you can go to the Google. There wasn't a question there, was there, Gabriel?
Probably.
What?
Okay, we'll go to the Google Sheet. So number 3, I would like to point out the disciplinary distinction between settler colonial studies and the decolonial theoretical work. There are problems with both and critiques to both, but they should not be conflated. Settler colonialism arose in North America with that perspective and area and theoretical view. Decolonial perspectives arose in Latin America. They are conflicting in many ways. Some argue that decolonial theory is inherently more epistemic than political. This last point might be most important, that decolonial theory shifts the epistemic view rather than forward a political agenda. Thank you for this enriching talk and perspective. The issue is complex, intertwined issue of politics and identity. There are many ways to describe displaced people, migrants, exiled, diasporic, etc., etc. There are also many ways to describe political relations, colonial, imperial, and so on. The terms used and their precise definitions in the appropriate field makes a big difference. So I suppose, what is the question here? This is just a point.
Yeah. Thank you for that point. Yes, I probably didn't make that clear enough in my presentation, the distinction between the two.
Here's a question. I learned a lot from your talk, and I'm convinced by your argument that Jewish people do not count as settler colonialists. But could you say a bit about what you mean when you say that you support Israel? Can't we agree with your argument and yet still believe that Israel's violence against the Palestinians is unjustified?
Repeat that last bit again.
Whether we can agree with your view, but then also still criticize Israel for the way they've handled the Palestinian.
Sure. Well, of course, yeah. And I hope the what I put forward stands on its own account as an overview of settler colonialism and its flaws and its problems. And that is separate from my view on it, my personal view on Israel, of course.
Given that peoples move territories throughout history, to what extent is the identification of a peoples as indigenous only a temporal historical designation and not a defensible view of all time? In other words, do claims to indigeneity have a timestamp?
No, I don't think it has a time stamp. I think Maori, we will always be indigenous to the land. This is the land where our unique culture developed. You won't find Maori culture or Maori as connected to a land anywhere else in the world. This is the only place where you have Maori because we're indigenous here, and we'll always have that indigenous status. Of course, there are political questions in our country at the moment about what does that mean. Does that mean that Maori have more rights than other citizens? And we're going through those sort of debates now. But, I think indigenous people are always indigenous. Now, when I say that, of course, you have the diaspora, and we have a Maori diaspora. We have Maori who live in Australia and all around the world, and but they are indigenous to this land. Even if they live all their lives out somewhere else, their roots are in this land as a people and as a culture.
I mean, if there's no other questions, I'll just keep going because I would. I would distinguish between. Someone else has a question?
Perhaps a thing on what Sheree just last said. If people, responding to the question, if people move around, the Jews or Maori, and assimilate wherever they live in England or in Brazil, and lose their historical connection to their culture, then that's a different thing. But if the culture with the connection to the original country where it grew is maintained, then the indigeneity is also maintained. That's how I see it.
Yes, for sure. And I think there's a difference between individuals and how they want to identify themselves and people groups. And, you know, indigeneity is about peoples and how peoples identify themselves. So individual Maori might just decide they don't want to be identified that way. They don't have any connection to their roots, to their culture, and that's fine. And I'm sure Jewish people are the same, you know, that. So, yeah.
Yeah, so my other point that I wanted to raise is that I think a lot of the conflict over who's indigenous and who isn't is, you know, complicated by the fact that people think that if you're not indigenous, you have to leave. And those are actually different subjects. You know, you could be indigenous, but that doesn't mean you can kick everybody else out. It's a separate issue. We might want to divide the land according to other principles. We might want to divide land according to the needs of various peoples. You know, I wouldn't want to say it one way or the other at this point, but the question of who's indigenous to the land is a separate issue and should be separated from the land question.
Yeah, I agree. And of course, in New Zealand, this is a hot topic at the moment. I think it's clear who's Indigenous, although there are people who dispute that Māori are Indigenous people. That there are theories about people who were here before, prior to, but again, that doesn't define indigeneity. But the questions going on here are about what does that mean as Māori strive for self-determination? How does that impact other citizens? And this is the parliamentary debate that's been going on here around these very issues, and those are very complex. But in terms of Israel, of course, the whole question has become politicized because of the attacks on Jewish connection to the land, particularly from the UN, but others as well, even trying to deny the Jewish connection to Jerusalem and to the most holy places in Judaism. So it's a very political issue. And of course, you know, the assertion of Palestinian indigeneity, which is actually quite recent as well, has been very political, intended to try to divest Jewish connection in the land. So it is very political. I see Alexander has a hand raised.
Alexander, please.
Yeah, so I mean, one concept that hasn't come up too much in our discussion yet, but I think is highly relevant to the case of Israel is nationalism, right? I mean, so when I think of Zionism, I think of it partially in terms of the 19th century discourse of nationalism in Europe that was going on, which celebrated indigeneity, the indigeneity of Germans and Italians and Hungarians and Poles on their ancestral land, wanted to revive their ancestral languages and so forth. And so even though at certain points, obviously the Balfour Declaration, the Zionists worked with the existing imperial authorities, it seems much more, from an academic point of view, much more fruitful to think of Zionism in terms of 19th century European nationalism. The waves of the revival of Hebrew, the desire to return to the land, with the peculiarity that Jews were largely dispersed, right? In other words, for the 2,000 years, Jews were not on their indigenous homeland. Well, obviously there were some, as you pointed out, but the European Jews who were promoting Zionism were living in Austria and France and Russia and other places. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, the template of nationalism rather than imperialism. And sometimes nationalism is thought of as anti-imperialist because it values self-determination, the self-determination of a people. Certainly the Austrian Habsburgs found nationalism a very thorny issue. So, you know, the anti-imperial nationalism. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, you're right that Zionism arose in that period of nationalism, all kinds of nationalisms, and of course, Arab nationalism was very fertile during that early 20th century as well. So that was the moment, I guess. That was the moment. But I guess I also see with Zionism, there is that political movement that was, you know, began with Herzl, or prior to Herzl, but in the 19th century. But then, you know, Zionism is also an ancient idea. It's probably a religious idea. It's so embedded in the scriptures and in the culture and the thinking for many, many, many centuries. So there's kind of a wider, broader perspective on Zionism, but specifically the political Zionism, which led to the establishment of the state, was certainly a national movement and a movement towards self-determination of a people. It's interesting that at the beginning of, you know, immediately after the Balfour Declaration, where there's a promise of a homeland, there was still debate as to what that homeland looked like. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that it would be a state. You know, there was discussion about it becoming part of the British Empire, or, you know, becoming a Commonwealth, part of the British Commonwealth. So, yeah, but it was an interesting dynamic period.
I believe there might be another question in the Google Sheet. Do you have any thoughts on which, if any, arguments you have seen be most useful in debating with those with the colonialist studies outlook? What is the best way to talk across different views here? As someone pointed out, marshaling more facts doesn't seem to work, nor does pointing out inconsistencies in application of the theory. So any good news? What might help open people's minds?
Can I have some more specifics about context? What kinds of questions? It's a very broad question. If you can give me some more specifics, I might have something more helpful to say. Kind of depends who you're talking about and what topic and what particular context.
Maybe I can rephrase the question. It seems like the anti-colonialist versus the pro-Western stance. It seems like we can't talk with one another. We can't solve these problems with the frameworks that we have. So have you come across any frameworks for being able to maybe settle some of the debates that we have? That's how
I guess it depends which debates they are.
Well, like land rights.
I mean, I find land rights, yeah. I think one thing that is helpful is about person-to-person interaction with people from the other side, so that you are humanizing the conversation, perhaps getting to know them and actually hearing what their concerns are and where they're coming from. Because as this question kind of points out, sometimes words and arguments are not cutting through, but perhaps if we actually try and learn to understand each other and understand the other person's concerns, then we might make progress in conversation. So again, it kind of depends on what the context is. If it's a you know, person to person, then it's probably worth the effort of developing that relationship. But you know, it depends. There are some people you'll talk to that are never going to shift or budge, and there's actually no point talking to them. You quickly can figure out who those people are. So it depends on the situation and context and topic.
I think that's a wonderful point that you made just now, and a wonderful point to maybe to end on, which ties in with our ideal of conversation in this group, which is we've spoken about it as a Socratic conversation, which would mean listening to the other person and really trying to understand what they're saying, but not necessarily accepting it. Trying to understand and maybe challenge asking questions, which is what Socrates did. We've spoken about it as a gentle Socratic method because actually Socrates made people pretty angry. So we're not really going there. But I want to thank everyone for coming to hear this lecture at an unusual hour for some of us, and really a fantastic, fascinating subject. And I want to thank Sheree for presenting it so beautifully, and everyone for asking the questions that they asked. We have these meetings every 3 weeks, approximately. Our next meeting is scheduled in 3 weeks, should be on the China situation with our good friend Shale Horowitz, and more interesting things to come after that. So if you're not on our list, please send me a mail and we'll put you on our list. And see you next time.